Hello and welcome to Jedi Journal. Today marks the beginning of a Halloween-themed mini-series with one of my longest friends in the Jedi community, Jasta Takara. Jasta, why
Hi.
don't you tell people about yourself?
Sure. So I was knighted in the Jedi community about 15 years ago. And since then, I've kind of done my own thing. I have my own little corner of the internet, the Order of the Jedi, where I just post occasionally my thoughts about meditation, martial arts, metaphysics, things like that. In my real life, I teach Tong Sudo, yoga, Tai Chi, and I also work in tech. So I also have that kind of corporate strategy perspective of things. That's pretty much me in a nutshell. Oh, I guess I should add that the reason I'm here today is because I'm a druid with the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids and the Anglesey Order of Druids. And when Ali was looking for a Halloween spectacular, spooktacular, I suggested something spiritual because that's what I'm very involved in. And we came up with the idea of talking about force ghosts. Ali, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that before I do.
I'm actually really looking forward to the topics we chose to speak on during this series. As Jasta said, today's topic, we're going to be discussing Are Force Ghosts Real? In 2019, just to kind of give you a little bit of because I do research things. In 2019, Ipsos, the world's third largest marketing research company, conducted a study where they contacted about 1,005 American citizens over the age of 18 and asked them whether or not they believed in ghosts. 48%, nearly 50, said they did, which, okay, it's less than half, but still a pretty big chunk of people. Ghosts are typically regulated to this superstitious side of humanity due to leaps in science and our logical brain. Still, ghosts are all over our pop culture, and they are even a part of the Star Wars universe. In the original trilogy, we get to see our first Force ghost as Ben Kenobi. And then we also kind of given this idea that the Force ghosts are particularly special in that only Jedi Masters can obtain the status, at least according to the films. And then at the end of the prequel trilogy, we discover that even Jedi Masters cannot easily obtain this ascension. Yoda tells Obi-Wan that Qui-Gon seems to have learned how to do this thing, and no one else has been able to pass this on during Yoda's 864 years of life. So if we go outside of the movies, though, we find that there are also Sith which achieve this status. I hear the arguments. Canon says they aren't actually Force ghosts, but honestly, that kind of depends. If you go to Wikipedia, it still lists them as Force ghosts. So anyways, Jasta and I thought this would be a fun discussion. So before we get into exploring the two religious tracks that we wanted to dive into, mine's going to be from the Christian side, I thought we could talk about what the significance of Force ghosts are in the fiction currently.
Absolutely. The significance in the fiction. One thing you said that I just want to sort of go back to is 48% of people believe in ghosts. And I think that's 48% of people will admit they believe in ghosts. I think when something spooky happens in the middle of the night, everybody gets that feeling of could it have been? They may not want to admit that that's what they thought, but it will happen. So in the fiction, it's interesting that it happens on the dark side too. I didn't know that. When I think of ghosts in general, I think of obviously there's the spooky spirit that haunts you. But then I also think of the question of what haunts you in other ways? What words were said to you in your past that haunt you? What people in your past haunt you? And in a way, the Force ghosts in the fiction represent that as much as they represent actual spiritual beings. There is supposedly a voiceover where Qui-Gon Jinn yells to Anakin to drop into the sand when he's being chased by something. I don't know. I remember reading this. I don't know if it's true or not. But the idea that a Force ghost can come to you as a voice, that it can come to you as an actual spirit, that it can come to you in your dreams, that it can come to you in all of these different ways, kind of represents how in our mundane, non-fictional lives, the people who touched us and had these significant impacts on us come to us in our dreams, in our memories, in our recollections of what they said to us, even if they're not appearing to us physically. And I think when I think about the Force ghosts appearing physically, they're often in the background, right? They're not always actually communicating with the person, but they're in the background, kind of watching over. And so it's very similar, again, to how sometimes we can feel like our ancestors or our people who have touched us again in our lives are watching over us, even if they're no longer with us corporeally. So that was kind of, that's where I'm going with that. What about you, Allie?
So for me, I think that it's very much the manifestation of something that was written much later, and that's the Jedi Code that has there is no death, there is the Force. So it kind of shows that life can carry on past this realm. But what I loved about it was that it's still saying that we are connected to those people in some way, and that maybe it kind of opens up the dialogue in your head, like, what happens after you die? And what do we need to do here in this life? Like, this is kind of the thing where Yoda is saying, okay, listen, this guy figured it out, but a lot of other masters can't. That says something about the kind of work that you need to put in if you want to achieve a place of value, which, you know, kind of goes to a Catholic perspective of sainthood. Like, effectively, these Force ghosts, if we go with current canon, says that you would have to become a saint in order to achieve this status. And then by doing that, you carry on the opportunity to actually continue to help people afterwards. So it says something about what you need to do in your life, and it says something about the abilities that people have. Just as you said, you can call back. I love that you actually tied it to that idea of, even if it's just a mental construct, it's still so very important. But I think that that's one of those things. It brings upon us this idea of the greater spirituality of things. And what Lucas's idea was when he inserted the Force at all was to get us to think about whether or not God exists. And we know that Christianity is not the only one that has these ties back to, you know, our ancestors can come back and be participatory in our lives. Obviously there's ancestral worship altogether. The Chinese have a lot of that in their worship, and so do the Okinawans have that. They're very ancestral based, just so forth on. But it's, you know, I don't know, as someone who enjoys the spirituality of all things and exploring that concept, it was important to me to see that there was some sort of manifestation of it inside of the series, because it acknowledged that that is something that connects us to other people around us.
It's funny to bring religion in to a certain extent because it very much depends which religion you're looking at. If you're a religion that deals in reincarnation, actually the thought of being stuck as a Force ghost means you did something really wrong.
That's true. I mean, I would think though, like, I don't know. And that's just another tie to it. You did something wrong, but what if it was that you did everything right? So it brings those things into mind, but you left something behind. And the ghost thing, like using it as a word instead of Force spirit, is kind of also interesting, because we have this connotation in our head as to what all ghosts are, and we forget that sometimes ghosts can be helpful. And the idea that
you're right. We
so
tend to think ghosts if it's malevolent, and spirits if it's like a spirit guide or a helpful spirit. Yeah.
So, I mean, it could have just been like a throwaway term that he came up with. I don't know. But it's also difficult when we have so many distinctions as to what these different spirits are. Because even ghosts are technically spirits. They're just a subdivision of that. And yeah.
And then you have subdivisions of ghosts. You have poltergeists, you have shadows, you have shades, you have the ones that play on repeat and the ones that actually can interact with you. So yeah,
Yes,
full spectrum of ghosts.
very much so. So, jumping in, I mean, I have some notes here, but I kind of want to hear, like, I'm sure a lot of people have this idea in their head of what Christianity has to say about ghosts. But it's not as often understood what is known in other religious practices, such as Druid. Oh, so when you think of this, is there a particular terminology that relates more closely to what is portrayed as a Force ghost in the fiction?
Tough one. For me, that would definitely fall under ancestral guidance. And I'm, all disclaimers in place. I don't speak for all Druids. I don't speak for all Celtic practitioners. That would just be me in particular. I do a lot of work to connect with the spirits of my ancestors, as a Celtic woman, as a Welsh woman. And so for me, they're very much the embodiment of that, where you can do ritual to sort of part the veil, is called. And I think Wiccans use that too. And communicate with the people who've gone before you. If your bloodline is the same as theirs, the connection is already there. It's much stronger. And a lot of druids and witches too, actually, that I know, will talk about how they can feel their ancestors in their own blood if they do it correctly, if they, meditate on it. And they have those channels of communication fairly readily available. So yeah, for me, that's very much how I lean towards viewing the Force ghosts. It's interesting because they're not actually ancestors, they're mentors. So the idea that you could speak with mentors past then is more, it's almost like guided imagery, like meditation. Like if you wanted to go back in time and talk to, say, Merlin or Morgan Le Fay, pick some really easy Arthurian ones for everybody. Or a character from the Mabinogion, you could go into like a guided meditation, a guided trance-like state, and theoretically put yourself in the same room as them and talk to them. Would you be actually talking to them, or would you be talking to your manifestation of them, your mental construct of them? Always a great question. I think in the Golden Dawn, they teach magic is always true and always a load of crock. And it's the job of the magician to suspend the disbelief and to believe that something amazing could be happening right now, and to choose so that that be your life, so that have an amazing life rather than to have the load of crock life. And I definitely, with Catholicism too, that I think there's an element of that, because you have I think it's the transfiguration of the bread and the wine into actual body and actual blood. And you can go into that thinking this is a load of crock, or you can go into it thinking something amazing just happened. And I think it's part of our free will, sort of borrowing from the Christian theme there, which kind of life we want to live. We want to live this spiritual life, or we want to have this more mundane life.
Yeah, definitely. So
that's a quick thought. Holy Ghost. That's a positive way of using the word ghost too. We do say the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost.
That's true. Yeah. And some refuse to use that term. Some are like, no, don't call it a ghost. It's a spirit. Yeah, no, they can be very vehement against it. So for me, I think that it relates, I think the most closest approximation that you can get in Catholicism is saints. Even though that also includes the archangels, which were not here on earth as humans. So
allegedly.
Allegedly.
There's a lot of Nephilim, giants.
That's fair.
Conversation one day.
Yeah, that is fair. But so I think saints are a really good one. But for anybody that's not Catholic, probably the big one for me is actually in the New Testament. I mean, there's a couple of them. And that's that during the transfiguration of Jesus, and I know where your head went when I put the note on there, you're like, oh, Jesus is a Force ghost. Actually, I wasn't going with Jesus. I was going with Moses and Elijah. So Elijah was taken up. Like we see him going into the cave. He parts the Jordan, goes into this cave across the Jordan. Everybody sees it. And while he's in there with Elisha, he's taken up into heaven. And so we are led to believe he doesn't actually die. And then Elisha is like, hey, give me a double portion of yourself, takes on this extra spirit, which, you know what, one day we're gonna have to do an episode on that one. She and I talk about things and we come up with different ideas, and a lot of them come up because she says something. I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. But like, so anyways, so he goes and then like he leaves, and he doesn't leave with Elijah. So we're all led to believe that from his testimony in this story that Elijah did not die. And there's only like, I think one other person in the Bible that did not die, and that was Enoch, which here or there, you can believe in the book of Enoch, it doesn't matter, but he did not die, according to the Bible. Now, Moses was buried in Moab. We see it in Deuteronomy 34. He was buried in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. And still no one to this day knows where his grave is, but he was buried, and he was buried by many people. So he is underneath the ground, but he comes in this when we see Jesus transfigured, because we know that Peter and I don't remember who else was there. I know Peter was there, but Peter and like two other people see this happen, and they're like, hey, we can build a tent for you and Moses and Elijah. Like, you each get your own tent. And either they got Moses wrong and it was actually Enoch, or they got Moses correct. Like, how else would you think that's Moses? If you knew Elijah was the one that went up and you know of Enoch, Moses doesn't make any sense anymore. But Moses is supposedly present for this. So that's, at least one Force ghost. Because if Elijah's not dead, he's not really a ghost. So then we see another incident, which is lesser known. And believe it or not, when I was in Iraq, I had an argument with a guy until he was a Mormon. And me and my friend were like, that never happened. And he goes over, he's like, hand me your Bible. We're like, maybe in the Book of Mormon. He goes, now hand me your Bible. He pulls it up, Matthew 27, 50 through 54. It says, and when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. And they came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. And when the centurion and those with him were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. Now, this tells us that they were kind of zombie-esque. But if we look at the story and we understand what Jesus had become, his body was gone, his body was renewed into something else. That is something that it could be. And then if we want to attribute the same thing happening to Jesus as it happened to these people, we could easily say Jesus was Force Ghost Jesus. So
I gotta say, holy people, dead holy people wandering Jerusalem is a terrifying thought. That's your Halloween special right there.
There you go, right? Like, what? And then after this, saints are able to, so after this, we see in Catholicism that saints are able to come in and interact with us. I mean, it takes a while, I think, for that to really come to fruition. But then you have with Catholicism, like I said, if you didn't want to go with Catholicism, but now we're going back to Catholicism, you have several Marian apparitions, and apparitions would be these Force ghosts, because that's one of the things that you have to have with sainthood, is like there has to be an apparition and well, actually it's not an apparition, you have to have a miracle that's associated with it, and there can be apparitions. So this is kind of very much the same. And as I said earlier, like you have to achieve a certain status here in life to obtain that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm just thinking about I'm thinking through, Druidry, Celtic background. I think the closest thing we would have would be the characters of the Mabinogion, which became the deities, the pantheon, the gods and the goddesses, Arianrhod, Blodaiwedd, all of those, Gwydion. It's interesting though, because when you throw Jesus into the mix, that I would say that separates him from the Force Ghost world, because of the messianic part of that, where he is going to come back specifically with purpose and to do something specific, whereas the Force Ghosts don't necessarily seem to do that. But I'm going to argue myself, because we talked about how Qui-Gon was the first one and the only one to figure this out for the longest time. And the idea that Anakin was the chosen one and Qui-Gon figured out how to come back because he knew someone had to be there to make this go, lead to Anakin's eventual redemption and all of that, would then suggest an almost messianic purpose in Qui-Gon Jinn, where he has to come back to guide the chosen one, even if it's from whispering in Yoda's ear, so that when Luke finally shows up all these years later, Luke is prepared to go. And we do have that messianic attributions in the story of Ben de Gaedflan. He was a king in Wales who apparently, after he was beheaded, his head continued to talk for 3 days and was carried to the castle Harlech, where he gave instructions for how he should be buried so that he could defend Britain from any future threats through being presumably a Force ghost. And then also King Arthur, who is supposed to, well, funny story, King Arthur supposedly dug up the head of Bran when he came into power and was like, the only protection that Wales needs. And then obviously was unsuccessful in defending the British Isles. Ultimately, when he died, he was taken to Avashon, or Avalon in English. And he is supposed to come back too and destroy all of the threats to the Welsh people in his next reign. So it's also funny how you have these like chosen peoples, right? Each of these stories that has a messianic person does have these sort of chosen peoples. Qui-Gon's chosen peoples was Coruscant, the Jedi. And then, of course, Christianity have the people of Israel, and of course, we have the people of Wales.
Well, yeah, because you want to protect your family. And if other people are coming in to destroy your family, you kind of localize.
Yeah. Well, that's what a lot of ancestral work can be about for people in Druidry, calling upon the ancestors to offer aid, to offer protection, the strength of the bloodline, as opposed to the strength of a single person, and that thought that you are the result of all of these people fought and loved and sacrificed in order for you to have a good life. And so it's your job now to have a good life, to honor them, so that the bloodline will continue, and then you will also be part of the strength of the bloodline for the next generation and all of that fun stuff.
Then I guess that makes an interesting case when it comes with Jesus, because Jesus opens the door for everybody. And if you really look at the Old Testament, the intent was that God was supposed to reveal himself to the world through Israel, and Israel was supposed to lead us. Like you even see Peter or Paul, I never remember which one wrote which book, and I don't remember which book this was in anyway, writes the Jews in a congregation that is following Christ. And he's like, if you guys stand by everything, we were promised to be the spiritual leaders of the world by God, so that we could take everybody into the new world, not just Israel. And that was kind of the voice, or the message at the at Pentecost. Like when Jesus was here on earth, his whole point was to build up a group of people and build up Israel so that they would be prepared for the next step, which was to bring it to the Gentiles.
Actually, I know what you mean, because I visited St. Peter's Cathedral in Israel, and that is where he had the vision, the dream from God, that or from Jesus, I don't remember which, that he was supposed to find a way to open this religion up to the rest of the world. They built a cathedral there. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
So then it was Peter.
It was Peter. Yeah,
so.
well, it's always been interesting to me, just from, I don't know, horror movie perspective, I don't know, spiritualist, druid, the emphasis that we put on Jesus' blood, specifically his blood, not his spirit, not his soul, not his good intentions. It's always the blood of the lamb. It's always, because this blood was shed, this happens now. And that's such a theme in ancient religion. I don't want to get into like so much the human sacrifice elements of it, although obviously that's a part of it. It's just very difficult to talk about sensitively. And I wouldn't want to go on the record.
Give people the wrong ideas either.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Right. But very much the emphasis on the blood really harkens back to those sort of like pagan ideas that, if you bury a body in the garden, flowers will, you put seeds under the body, you bury it in the garden, nothing grows the first year. The second year, everything grows in like huge, abundant profusion, more than it ever would have before. And we see that in the graveyards in the UK. If you ever visit, they're all like totally dripping with ivy. They're just covered in moss and grass and flowers. They are wildernesses.
Aren't poppies also supposed to spring forth from that? And that's why we use them for Memorial Day?
Exactly. And then in mythological terms, the island of Avalon is an orchard of apple trees. And the reason that everyone is buried, or everyone of significance is buried in Avalon, is so that the trees will grow from their blood. And, the apple then represents the ability to connect to the other world, but it has to be grown in Avalon in these certain circumstances for that to be true.
So I am curious, because I know that, you do a lot of research, and I know that you've specifically looked into like Christian Judaic traditions. Is there a tie to the apple tree being associated with good and evil after we find out about Avalon?
I think it's really deliberate, I think is the right word to use. I think that, Avalon being the holy island of apples, it literally, by the way, the word for apple in Welsh is aval. And so aval on the island of apples. So these trees that are being grown from the bodies of the significantly deceased absolutely contain the knowledge of all good and evil. And, if you cut an apple the right way, you have the pentagram in the middle. And everybody knows that little party trick for Halloween these days. And that's symbolic of that knowledge. And so, it's very significant that Eve eats an apple that has a pentagram in the middle, and it gives her all of the knowledge of good and evil. That's very significant, and I think very deliberate.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to ask because it was there.
No worries. But then again, so the blood of the lamb, I think it's very significant that we always talk about Jesus's blood, his bloodline strengthening now, not only the bloodlines of Israel, which they're very particular about too. The tribes of Israel are very particular about the bloodlines of Israel. But he's not just strengthening the bloodlines of Israel, he is strengthening the bloodlines of everybody. And it's, again, to me, it feels deliberate. When you look back at this ancient symbology, it's on purpose.
Cool. Sorry. Oh, I lost my thought because I was like, just wow. That's really,
All right,
we
have your
don't,
mind blown. That's
yeah.
what I'm
And
here for.
it's also kind of, it's interesting to me that we don't look at the significance of um different symbolism that we pour into things. Like, sure, someone that writes a story that's based in esotericism, like dealing with ghosts, and or the who is the guy that wrote like Angels and Demons? David Brown, whatever his name is.
Dan Brown, right?
Dan Brown. Yes. I had the D right. I had the Brown right. But so like if you write something in that and then you pull it in, but I don't think people really appreciate that those aren't just tools that are meant to facilitate the story. They're also meant to speak something to us. Just like, the apples in Avalon growing from, and I didn't even know that part, that, all the significant dead were buried there. I knew it was a holy space. I just didn't understand why. I thought maybe it was like the home of a god or a goddess. But yeah, so like we look at these different symbols, and maybe it's something that we should look even deeper at when we see symbolism in Star Wars, whether it's the lightsaber or the Force Ghost, because the people who write these stories are putting in a significant amount of work to come up with not just a story that's interesting, but will also pull us to explore our world in a different light.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty well known that Lucas, in his original incarnation of Star Wars, did a lot of research, did a lot of work into that. And, I've got my whole essay about the Jed, which is the Egyptian pillar, and how the hieroglyph for the Jed resembles the lightsaber, and how the Jedi were the people who could wield the powers of the pillar in ancient Egypt. I believe definitely influenced the choice of the name Jedi in the Star Wars universe. But even on a subconscious level, we have these symbols, archetypes in our heads. You see a guy with a sword, knight. You see a person doing magic, you're like, witch. And it doesn't take much actually for us to start tapping into that and to recognize that we already have this library of symbology and archetypes in our heads that we can tap into when we want to. But doing it consciously, mindfully, that's kind of where I would say witchcraft or magic or spell work kind of comes into play. I know a lot of people might be like, oh yes, burn a green candle for money, of course. Green equals money, ooh. But that doesn't actually work if green is in the color of your money, like it isn't in other countries. That association is different. And then I would honestly say you might be surprised by how, if you started to surround yourself with symbols of prosperity, that you find yourself becoming attracted to other symbols of prosperity without even recognizing them. And that would elevate your position as a prosperous person. And I don't know, we think we know what's going on in our heads. And I swear 99% of the time we don't. But we can definitely hack into it with symbols and other tools like that.
Definitely. So we've kind of talked a little bit about different religions, and you mentioned also that ancestors can become gods themselves. I think that's definitely so ancestral worship does not necessarily mean that they do become gods. They're even more elevated than just the normal ancestors, and some do. The word in Japan would be kami, but kami also includes gods, but not in lesser gods. And then they have other, like yoma for the darker spirits, and different words, just like we have different words. I spent some time in Japan. If anybody who's watching this podcast or listening to this doesn't know that, but like there is even theories that Pele was a living human being first, that like, and she came in on the second Like there were a number of different, what was,
I don't know. A bunch of balloons just floated past your face.
that was
Pele saying
weird.
hi.
Is there a ghost in the computer?
Ghost in the machine. I think it was Pele saying hi. She was like, oh, hey, you haven't forgotten me.
So Pele, like I think it's like the second migration. They had several migrations over time in Hawaii, and I also spent time in Hawaii for those that don't know. So I did my research, but the theory is that she was in the second wave of migrations, and then when she died, she became the goddess. There's also the competing theory that she was always the goddess of the Hawaiian Islands. So like there's all kinds of different ideas of what really happened there, and no one's really sure what happened. But the idea that it's even there in their mind that a living human being would be able to elevate themselves so much and tie themselves so much to the land, the people, etc., is kind of an important thing that our ancient ancestors had there. Like you can put yourself into that position, and then it grows into this into Pele. Like, I mean, which is such a revered goddess there. Everything that happens with the lava flows is tied directly to her. So it's really interesting to see all of that. But so now we've kind of talked about different religious perspectives. But the question we asked is, are force ghosts real? Well, these are religious ideas of whether or not that's the case. But have you ever experienced something like that you believe was less a mental construct in your head and more, there's something going on here?
100%, multiple times. I actually saw my first spirit when I was, I'm going to say 7 years old, because I was old enough that I'd moved up into the attic bedroom, and I was young enough that my sister was still a baby. So this was my introduction to the supernatural. I was too young to have any preconceived ideas of this. The old house I used to live in was about 500 years old, and it used to be a tannery. It's a little Welsh village. And at night, to go to bed, I would go up the stairs, turn the corner, walk down the corridor, brush my teeth, and then I would go up another flight of stairs to go to my little attic bedroom. And one night when I was brushing my teeth in the little bathroom, I stepped out of the doorway, and to my left, coming down the hallway, I saw a figure, and no features, nothing. Is what we would call nowadays probably a shadow person, except that at its abdomen, there was an orb of golden light. And this thing that looked human from the top to about the waist, and then was carrying like a glowing orb of light like this big, at its abdomen, was just floating down the corridor straight towards me. And I was terrified. I screamed. I ran up into my bedroom so fast. So my parents came running up the stairs. This is how fast I ran up the stairs. And they were like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay? What happened?" And I was saying, "Were you down there just now? Were you in the corridor just now? Did you see someone? Did you see something?" And they were like, "There is nothing down there. It's just us. You're safe. You're okay." And they tried to convince me I'd seen nothing. I'm 37 years old now. Nothing will ever convince me that I didn't see that. I remember it perfectly, plain as day. Shadow figure, orb of glowing golden light in front of it. And that was the first. My brother actually confided in me afterwards that he'd seen something in that house too. And he'd seen it coming out of the bathroom, just like I had. This is going to sound cheesy, but in later years, I've kind of wondered, like, was that my first visitation of a spirit? Was the golden orb kind of the gift that it was giving me of, spirituality, of sight, of whatever you want to call it? Because since then, I have been able to see spirits without much difficulty, without a lot of trouble, to communicate with them. You know, when I visit my family, they'll be like, "Are there any ghosts in the house? Can you check?" So it's a complete 180 from telling me there's nothing there, you're fine, to can you check for ghosts?
Wow.
I've had weird things happen. Like there was one night I had all of the strings on my guitar just break. And, you know, atmospheric pressure, sure, I believe if one of them broke, but they all went. And it was a loud break in the middle of the night, woke me up. When my father died, I definitely believe that he came and said goodbye to me. That's a very emotional story. I'll cry if I tell that, so I won't tell it now.
Yeah, no, that's understandable.
When my cat died, and I got another cat, this one freaked me out a lot. So it's one thing to deal with humans. When you see animals do it, it's a bit like, okay, it's not me making stuff up. I still have a statue of Bast, the cat goddess. And when Lucy died, I put her ashes right next to it. And then the cat that I have now, Meg, very first night in my house, she was terrified. She had been under the bed all day. She wouldn't come out. She wouldn't talk to anybody. Terrified rescue cat. But that first night, 4 o'clock in the morning, I wake up to the sound of her jumping onto a 6-foot-tall bookshelf where the statue of Bast is and Lucy's ashes are. And she sat there with her head bowed. And I got this chill. She's a big cat, by the way. She's a big, like, Siamese cat.
Oh, wow.
So to see this, like, monster cat with her head bowed in front of the statue of Bast and the ashes of Lucy. And she stayed like that for a good 2, 3, 4 minutes, freaking me out the whole time. And then she jumped down. She's never jumped up there again. She never goes and sits next to the statue of Bast ever again. She just, it was almost like she was receiving a message from Lucy and or Bast, you know, and yeah, definitely a spooky moment. It always happens 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. That's how you know it's really a ghost.
3 o'clock spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? What are your ghost stories?
So, incidentally, my ghost stories are not what you would traditionally think of as ghost. I do have stories of spirits. That I. So my first one was actually my living father. I think he was dead. Like, oh, it's okay. I'm just gonna explain what the incident was. So my father was still alive. He was at work. He died many years later. I was still living with him, and he was a very abusive person. So I'm sitting there with my brother, and we're like laying down in this doorway and watching my mom read a book. And my brother didn't see this, or if he did, he has no memory because we were like 5 years old, something like that. Well, I would have been 5 and he would have been 4. But so I saw this fire spring up from the floor. And when it died down, my father was in the middle begging my mother for forgiveness.
Wow.
And I was paralyzed. I'm like, what the heck? Like, how do you respond to that? I had never been exposed to anything of the sort. I didn't know what a ghost was. I didn't know anything. I just knew my father was at work, and somehow this fire came up out of nowhere, and there he is begging my mom for forgiveness, who is just reading a book and has no idea what's going on either.
Now, see, I would say that's a vision more than an entity. Because I think when we're talking about ghosts or spirits, it's, for me, the word entity is what I think of, because it's something external. It's something with a mind of its own, perhaps. This sounds like a vision.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, and it could have been a vision, or it could have been across time. Because,
Yeah.
when you think of things like that, and this is actually something I talk about in my class on compassion, or on forgiveness ceremony, which I may come up with a better name. I don't know. I think you were there when I was talking about trying to create this thing back on FA. But I talk about it because I'm saying in there, I say, I think that through the Force, I really believe you can reach across time and you can try to get a message to someone. And I think that's what was happening here. But clearly my mom didn't get it. I mean, she did later when I told her about it, long after he died, but clearly she didn't get it at the time. So,
It's not just time, that would also be interdimensional.
yeah, it would. Yeah. So it's and that kind of just ties into my whole theory of how the Force works and whatnot. But he was sitting there apologizing and begging for forgiveness, and then the fire springs back up, and when it dies down, he's gone. So, that was kind of my first encounter, like the one that pulls everything together, that maybe things that were going on in my head were not necessarily just things going on in my head. And then consistently after that, or well, periodically after that, I should say, I would have little things that just kind of happen, a lot more with dreams. And then the big one that really occurred was when I was 16 years old. I had an encounter with an angel of the Lord who was in this dark cloud, and the dark cloud kind of hid a figure behind it. Like I could tell it was a humanoid figure, but it was dark figure. I couldn't tell you anything else about it. I couldn't tell you if he was Caucasian, if he was Jewish, if he was, I don't know. It was just kind of humanoid figure. And that entity, that angel told me that I needed to go back to Christianity, because at the time I was pagan, and that was when I was 16 years old. It's actually the event that led me to eventually joining Force Academy in about a year later. So there were those instances that just kind of like led up to that. And then from there, I didn't quite go back to Christianity. Like I've had this wild story about what it took to get me back to Catholicism, where I am now. And there's no telling where this story is going to end by the end of it. I just know that right now, Catholicism is where I'm at. I think that's where I was supposed to return based on a number of different things. But from there, I've had interactions with deities from different pantheons. The Okinawan deity, I've encountered her, I believe. I've encountered the deities on Hawaii. I've encountered deities or spirits. Can't say deities in Iraq, because I would say more demonic forces in Iraq. And just different things that have occurred, but none of them I would ever really say was actually a ghost, like somebody that has departed and come back. So if we said that those also are Force ghosts based on how the fiction puts them, then I would say yes, they fulfill that requirement to say that I have experienced that, and that's what I believe. Whether anybody else thinks that I'm crazy or not, I don't care. That's what I believe. That's what happened to me.
No, and it's, it is that question of how specific do you want to get? Obviously, when I'm talking about the spirit of my deceased father, my deceased grandmother, those are, I would say that's your Force ghosts. Those are people who live, people who touched me in my real life, people who I feel fortunate to be able to reach back out to when I really need to. Although actually, interestingly in that one, my dad is actually passed on. Like he came to say goodbye, and that was that. And I'm happy for his spirit, if that's what his spirit needed. It's my grandmother who stuck around. And I do tarot, scrying, pendulum, all kinds of runes work to work with the dead. And it's funny to me in some ways that she's the one that stuck around. Deities is then, not really Force ghosts as we see it in the fiction. That's another thing. angels, again, angels is the interesting one for me because I'm like this deep into conspiracy theories. I'm not completely convinced that angels weren't beings that also occupied the earth with us at one point. But your description of the shadowy figure actually really sounds like my shadowy figure that I saw when I was 7, carrying the golden orb. So that's really interesting. Because it was the same. I couldn't tell you any features. I couldn't tell you anything except it was a black humanoid shape.
So I actually had to do a deep dive into the Bible to see if mine, because like I would tell people about my story and none of them would think until actually very recently. I actually got to a point where I was almost tearing up at church because somebody picked it up before I even asked them, do you know where you can find that in the Bible? And like every time I would ask, is there something in the Bible that meets this description? People would be like, no, you might have dealt with a demon. And I'm like, but I can't keep, like, I couldn't shake it. I tried to actually put that in my head. Maybe it was a demon and maybe I don't have to go back to Christianity. I did. I tried that. And for many years, I just couldn't shake it has to be Christian or it has to be an angel. And so I went through and I found that a dark cloud leads Israel out of Egypt and through the desert for years. And I'm like, how on earth is it I missed it? Just kind of like this whole, the saints come back from their graves when Christ is risen, and everybody misses that too.
Oh, I think with the Bible, we kind of get it in our heads that we know the story because we see it so many times, we hear it so many times. We have in our heads that we know the story. We know, yes, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. There's the 10 plagues of Egypt. We think we know it. And
so we just skim over the little details. Yeah,
exactly. And we probably skim over all of it without realizing it.
Yeah, that's fair. there is a lot that you look at it and you're like, oh, wow. And then you start jumping into other versions of it. Like I've got, this is the most expensive book I own.
Oh, wow.
The guy, like, he translated it, I think in 2010 or something like that. So he's still around, but he did there's like interesting little differences between that version and the Old Testament that we have of the same 5 books. And it was like $80 to buy that. And I got that on a sale for Black Friday. So it was even more money. But it is the most expensive book I own. And when you start comparing different things in there, it gets really interesting. I actually got a note in here for when we get to episode 2. But it's really, it's wild.
I believe it. What we have, the King James Version, especially the even more easy to read King James Version. I don't even know how to say that. I don't know what it's called. It's such a doctored piece of information at this point because it's been translated from the original language into Latin. And then, of course, Council of Nicaea were editing it to make it say what they wanted it to say so that the people would follow their lead. I don't know if you know this, there were scholars under house arrest for being magicians and pagans, and they forced them to write the Bible so that they didn't have to do it themselves. And that's why a lot of this symbolism gets kind of sneakily put in there. Things like the 4 Gospels representing the 4 sphinxes, the 4 parts of the Sphinx, because these magi, scholars, were basically told, hey, you can help us write the Bible or we'll execute you. What would you choose?
Right. Yeah.
So they write the Bible, but they're translating the Bible, and they're also making sure to emphasize their own ancient knowledge in there. So there was a translation a little while ago of the 4 Gospels that was done by a scholar here at UCLA, and he had demonstrated how each of the 4 Gospels represents the 4 parts of the Sphinx, and how just like the 4 parts of the Sphinx represent the whole magician, the 4 parts of the Gospel are basically the blueprint for how to be the Sphinx in reality, or how to be a Yeshua, how to be a magician yourself.
Yeah.
And there's a
Wow.
lot of that interesting stuff in there. So you got the original, you got the Latinized version of the original, you've got the Latinized plus what those scholars felt like putting in there is plus what the politicians wanted in there. Then it gets translated into English and what the English kings wanted in there.
Well, yeah, but see, the more interesting thing is that the English version, the first English version was based on the Masoret text, which was actually written well after the text that was used to create the basis of the Catholic text in the Latin.
Oh,
So they are actually written differently. The Masoret text was a Jewish tradition, and so to get rid of all of the stuff, to get rid of all that stuff, that junk, King James was like, go to the Jewish text and grab that, which is why people are like, oh no, if you go back to the other text, you'll find it like there's so many different interesting things. Like one of the ones that I found really interesting was there's a psalm, and it says, for all the gods of the nations are, in Latin it says daemon, however you say that. It's a Greek word that we derive the word demon from. While the other one says eidolon, which is the word that the Hebrew use for idol.
oh, nice.
And idols are nothing. Eidolon means nothingness. So in one, it acknowledges that they are real entities. In the other one, it's just used to, it's a word that's used often when we're talking about like carved graven images. Those are nothing.
Yeah.
They have nothing to give you. So I found like you find little differences in those things, and you're like, oh wow. And people are like, oh no, the translations don't really matter. I'm like, but look at this one, it does matter, because it says multitude of things. Both
My
of them.
personal favorite is always Deuteronomy. You have over here, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Over here, thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live. One is like, this is a law. Like if someone poisons someone, don't let them live, execute them. The other one is obviously a political agenda of kill all the witches.
Right. And then you see that actually when we go to Talking with the Dead in the next episode, I'm going to bring that one up. That one isn't in Deuteronomy, it's in Samuel, but I'm going to bring kind of that discussion up.
So the second time we've mentioned the second episode, that makes me think we're inching towards the second episode.
Yeah, I think we are. So let's go ahead and let's end this one, and we'll join everybody else for the next episode. So thank you for joining us at Jedi Journal. May you awaken the Jedi within.